Hello, everyone. For some time now, there has been a debate raging in the political corner of YouTube between, on the one hand, the so-called skeptic community, or the liberalists, as those among them who follow Sargon of Akkad are known, and on the other hand, the alt-right. And although many subjects have been broached in the course of the clash between these two factions, the one I'd like to focus on in this video, because of how starkly it brings out a major difference in the overall worldviews of these two groups, is this question about the individual and the group and the relation of the one to the other, and also of the rights and obligations that one may have from the other or that one has to the other. Now, as those of you who may be familiar with my YouTube output might have been able to guess, I have overall found the discussion between the skeptics and the alt-right on this point to be rather disappointing and unedifying. In general, what I've tended to see when I've observed clashes between them is essentially just two people sitting down, beginning a discussion, and before very long just descending into essentially shouting their intuitions at one another without really making much in the way of an attempt to sort of try and bridge the divide between them, or to work out some reasonable or workable synthesis that incorporates the good or positive aspects of what each has to say. In fact, not only that, but it tends unfortunately to be the case that each side really sort of fails or deliberately chooses not to acknowledge when the other side does have something interesting or of value to say. They don't want to cede any ground or allow anything from the other side to be admitted as good, as reasonable, as worthy of consideration, and so forth. So, for example, from the alt-right, you tend to have this knee-jerk reaction where anyone who speaks in terms of individualism is immediately portrayed as some sort of nihilistic person who simply wishes to create a society in which individuals are completely unmoored from any social context or any sort of broader identity, and in which they kind of just float around willy-nilly and are essentially at the mercy of their passions or desires or whatever happens to overtake them at the moment, such that they have no real identity, such that they're just kind of rootless. And this, in part, comes from the alt-rights having discovered race realism and sort of its importance. When the alt-right has gone through the process of learning that, for example, there are average group differences in various traits between racial groups, and that these traits have a significant genetic component to them, they immediately realized the value and the importance that this information may have, for example, for things like immigration policy, such that if some particular racial group has a lower average IQ than some other, and IQ is highly heritable, and certain factors or qualities of a nation depend on the average IQ of that nation, things like the relative amount of corruption, overall sort of economic performance, and the general culture, its orientation toward things like democracy and relatively sort of liberal or sort of freedom-loving attitudes to various things. When this has been realized, and when it's been understood that these things like political attitudes, sort of cultural orientations, the sort of cultural substance of a society, when it was understood by the alt-right that these things are at least in significant part a function of genetics, and that they emerge out of the genetic constitution of the group that happens to comprise the nation in question, when this was understood, the alt-right immediately shifted to essentially trying to view things entirely from the prism of race and group dynamics. And so anyone who does not do this, or even doesn't do this to the extent that they might do it, is immediately portrayed as cucking, as ignoring the importance of groups, as being some kind of rootless and nihilistic individualist, and so forth. On the other hand, from the skeptic side of things, there is a tremendous worry among them that if ideas of collectivism are taken too seriously, and if too much emphasis is placed upon them, the danger will arise that the state within the particular society that does this, that overemphasizes collectivism, may then come to portray itself as being in some sense the embodiment or the voice or the representative of the people or the race or the group or what have you, and then begin acting as if it were the instrument of this collective will, but doing so in such a way that it merely uses that pretense of acting in the interest of the group as a sort of pretext for concealing its own personal motivations and the desire for power of the politicians making up the state, such that the state then becomes this kind of totalistic, totalitarian, all-encompassing force that sort of crushes individual initiative and perhaps can turn the nation into some sort of a beehive-like thing. And this is of course seen as quite terrible and undesirable by the skeptic/liberalist community. And so the moment that they detect any whiff of collectivism, they're immediately set off, much as the alt-right tends to be when they hear discussion of individualism. So that just as the alt-right assumes that individualism is immediately redolent of nihilism and rootlessness, so the skeptic community tends to assume that any emphasis on the importance of groups or of collective traits and such things as this immediately will lead by some sort of slippery slope to a kind of totalitarian state. And this insistence by both groups leads each of them to not really portray the other in essentially very good faith, and leads them to have what I would say is an especially unproductive discussion. And what I want to do in this video is to try and form a kind of workable synthesis between these two opposed notions of individualism and collectivism, such that the good or desirable or valuable aspects of each are incorporated into something that works, something that on the one hand upholds the value of the individual without discarding the importance of these average collective group traits for various purposes. And I'd like to do that in the following manner. When thinking about the question of the relation of the individual to the group of which that individual may or may not be a part, there are essentially, I would think, three ways to characterize the matter. One position, which I will call group realism, is essentially the view that the alt-right tends in favor of. And this is the view that groups have an existence of their own that in some sense stands over and above the individual, that supersedes the individual, that superordinates him, and that is at least in some sense of greater importance than the individual, such that if some individual interest, let's say a desire to have a very particular sort of sexual lifestyle, let's say, is in some sense harmful to the interests of the group, this, at least in some circumstances, may justifiably be overridden because the group is of greater importance, because it is the group that really exists in some deeper sense than just the individual, because without the identity that the individual receives from his group membership, he is rootless, he is in some sense nothing. And so given that it is the group context in which an individual happens to be embedded that determines, or at least to a significant degree shapes, who that individual turns out to be, then it is in some sense justifiable to say that the group in some sense is more real than the individual, or at least stands over and above him, or has some reality separate from the individual. I'd like to characterize this position as group realism, as sort of being a rough analog to the realist position on the question of universals. On the other hand, you have what is more or less the skeptic or liberalist position, which I will call group nominalism, which just says that when we employ collective terms like race or group or corporation or club or nation or whatever else, when we use these terms to say the race did so-and-so, or the German nation did such and such, or the state did this particular action, when we employ such collective terms, what we really mean to say is that there are certain specific particular individuals which share a common interest or common goal and are therefore acting as a group, as a unit, together to achieve that common goal, but that at the level of ultimate empirical reality, all that really exists, all that is really real, are those individuals. And so this position has it that it is only the individual that is really ultimately real in a kind of direct empirical sense. You can point to some particular individual and say that this person is here or there or doing such and such, but you cannot, in the same sense as that, point to, for example, the white race and say that the white race is this definite, delimited, circumscribed thing in the same way that an individual would be. And so the group nominalist will insist that only the individual is real, and that collective terms are really kind of a shorthand, because it would just be difficult and horribly wordy and prolix to always go about describing each and every individual that happens to be engaged in some collective endeavor, and so we create these collective terms to sort of simplify things for us. But the group does not really exist in the same sense that the individual does. Now, I think that there are problems with both of these positions, and that in various ways they take things too far. And I would like to suggest a third view, which is sort of a synthesis between these two, and I think discards their negative aspects and incorporates their positive aspects into a synthesis. And this view I'm going to call group epiphenomenalism. And on this view, the group, although it in some sense certainly exists, is epiphenomenal to the existence of the individuals which happen to comprise that group. On this view, individuals may come together either explicitly and deliberately, or implicitly and unconsciously, just as a result of sort of historical circumstance and cultural immersion, to uphold and promulgate and share together various sets of rules and practices that unite them. And these rules and practices, as I said, may either be explicit or implicit. They may be things that were specifically agreed upon as part of an explicit contract, like, for example, in the case of, say, a corporation, where managers, lower-level workers, members of the boards of directors, and shareholders have various relations to one another, and that these are spelled out in the legal structure of the corporate form, so that all of this is explicit. We know explicitly what these rules are that unite this collection of individuals, and that then lead them to the formation of a collective entity known as a corporation. In other cases, such as, say, with nations or races, these rules and practices may be implicit. It may not be possible for individual members of the race or the nation to really point them out, because they tend to be things that are just obvious to the members of that group, things that they don't necessarily think of especially deeply. So these could be various sorts of cultural practices, things that again are just sort of in the air, or just part of the unquestioned ethos of the culture. So, for example, among people of European descent, things like placing a value on free speech and freedom of expression, or the value of the individual, these things form our sort of implicit cultural inheritance. They are things that are so deeply ingrained within us that anyone who questions them too deeply creates a sense of revulsion, or leads us to object to various things. They go against our sort of deepest moral intuitions, because this is just part of who we are and part of our deepest cultural assumptions as Europeans. You might say that. And again, this can be extended out to any sort of group construct. So the group is a collection of individuals that have come together and agreed to associate with one another on the basis of various rules and practices which may either be implicit or explicit. And that the group, as an entity, emerges out of the individuals that comprise it, when those individuals stand in various relations to one another, which are determined by the rules and practices that make up that group. And so the group exists, it is real, but it is epiphenomenal to the individuals that compose it. It emerges as a secondary phenomenon out of the primary phenomenon of those individuals. And I'm going to try and argue for this position and against the other two competing positions, essentially through a series of thought experiments. So, for example, if one wishes to see the problem with group realism, one only needs to imagine the following scenario. If you believe that groups have an existence which is entirely separate from the existence of the individuals that comprise it, then, for example, what would you say would happen if every single white or European person on Earth were killed off, would you say that the white race would then still exist? Now, clearly not. I don't think even the most extreme members of the alt-right would quite say a thing like that. And if they did believe that, then it would be difficult to see why they would be concerned with things such as declining white birth rates or Arab or otherwise non-white immigration into European countries. Because even if every white individual were wiped out, in some sense the white race would exist because it has an existence above or superordinate over white individuals. So clearly not even the alt-right really quite takes it that far, although in some instances some of them may speak as if they are tending in that direction. So clearly, the existence of this group known as the white race depends on the survival and the continued existence of white individuals. And so in some sense, it does emerge out of those white individuals. Now, there are further thought experiments that we can perform. The alt-right tends to think of group identity primarily in terms of shared genetics. But when we speak of things like nations or races, there is clearly more to what it means to be of a certain nation or of a certain race than merely having the right set of genetics, a certain genetic constitution that falls within some particular cluster of genes. And by the way, by saying this, I am not implying in any way that I believe that race is not a meaningful biological construct or a concept. I understand what the notion of genetic clusters and taking various genetic loci and then sort of doing a cluster analysis on them, and then seeing that if you take combinations of genetic loci and split them off in various ways, that you can actually form genetic clusters to essentially an arbitrary degree of accuracy, as far as 99%, and that these clusters will correspond well to the races, to the various races that we think of in colloquial speech. So that's fine with me. I'm not questioning the biological validity of the race concept. I'm merely saying that when we think of something like a race or a nation, there is more to it than merely genetics. And to see this, here's another thought experiment. Let's take Germans, the German nation, the group of people that are genetically German. Let's take that group, and then let us suppose that all evidence of any history of Germany, of Germans as a nation, disappeared. All the memories of any historical action or any history of the German people disappeared from the memories of each of these individual Germans, such that none of them remembered anything about German history, and there was no physical or archaeological or documentary evidence to indicate to them that there has been this history of this group of people called Germans and that they did various things. Suppose that all of that had completely vanished. So there's no trace of any history for them anymore. And all you have is a certain collection of people with shared genetics that fit into some genetic cluster and a piece of land that they happen to live on. Now, would this group of people still be Germans? Well, in some sense they would be, right? In the pure sort of genetic sense they would be, because that has been unchanged. But they wouldn't be Germans in the same sense that we have thought of Germans, because now there is no Goethe anymore, there is no Kant, there is no Schiller, no Bach. None of these great cultural figures. The 30 Years' War and its effect on German history doesn't exist for them. There is no Bismarck, no reunification movement. All of that is gone. Hitler is gone. Everything is gone, such that the whole tapestry of German history as it existed previously is no longer there and doesn't any longer inform what it means to be a German. Now, given that this group exists as a genetic cluster, and that they inhabit a certain territory, it would be possible for this group to continue acting collectively and then, after enough time, form for itself a new history. But that new history would not be exactly like the old history. There would be differences between that new history and the history that was, such that when this new history is now formed and comes to inform and give meaning to what it means to be a German, what it means to be a German would then no longer mean the same thing that it used to mean when memory and evidence of the previous history still existed. So And again, you could apply this to any group, to Frenchmen, to the British, to Europeans as a whole, to any sort of collective entity, even something like a business or a company or a corporation. Eliminate the history of its founding and the various effects that the different CEOs have had on its development. And it would be, in some sense, a different company. It would be a different group. It couldn't be the same group that it was before. So history also matters in addition to genetics, and although things like culture and history are in part shaped by genetics, they are not fully determined by it. And so, in some sense, the cultural aspect of what it means to be part of some race or some nation stands above and is different from the merely genetic aspect of what it means to be part of that group. So there is more to group identity than mere genetics. There is an element of contingency to it. So there is some sense in which this extreme sort of realist concept of group identity has problems with it. On the other hand, there are obvious problems with the group nominalist concept as well. For example, it is clear that as an individual, you were born into a certain context, you grew up in a certain culture, you inherited a set of cultural assumptions that were shared by the people around you, and that these have informed your thinking and have shaped you and made you in part into who you are. Now, this is not to say that you have been completely determined by these forces, but you have to some extent been shaped by them, even if in various degrees and in various areas and at various times you may have resisted them for one reason or another. So individuals are not these kind of disembodied wraiths that float along outside of any context. You are born into a group context, and the groups that each individual belongs to do shape who that individual is. If you are, for example, a geologist, and you belong to the American Geophysical Union, and you think of yourself as a scientist, and that's part of your identity, well, then that's going to shape who you are as an individual, at least to some extent. If you like to meet up with a group of friends every week or so to play poker, let's say, well, then that group that you have formed with your friends, and that custom of meeting together weekly to play poker, also informs your identity. If you think of yourself as a Frenchman and you look back to Molière and Montaigne and Diderot and Voltaire and Charles Martel and all of the things that these men and others like them have done to form what it means to be French. If you think of yourself as a Frenchman and therefore as a member of the nation that was the eldest daughter of the Catholic Church, that is going to inform who you are. Similarly, if you think of yourself as German or an Italian or an American or what have you, or as just European more generally. So there's an aspect of the context, the group context into which an individual happens to be born, where that individual is a member of all sorts of groups, and that those groups contribute to the formation of the individual and make him who he is. The individual is not just something that is given. Community helps to form him. He may resist community, he may go against the grain in various ways, and so to some extent he does have certain powers of self-creation that stand separate from the groups which he may happen to be a member of, but nevertheless there is this group influence. So groups do exist in that sense. They do have real meaning, and it is ridiculous, as the alt-right is fond of pointing out, of just ignoring, for example, average racial differences when setting government policy, or when denying, when trying to establish things like immigration policy and so forth. That this is going to have appreciable and meaningful social consequences. So, for example, one thing that the alt-right likes to discuss are the results of Robert Putnam's study on diversity, where Putnam discovered that in neighborhoods or societies with significant amounts of racial diversity, these places tend to be balkanized, such that the various racial groups that live together do not come together into some sort of harmony and mutual understanding, but rather retreat into their enclaves and stick around with people that are like themselves. General civic engagement tends to decline, and overall social mistrust tends to rise violence and conflict tends to increase, and so forth. So there is this reality that individuals do feel themselves pulled to be members of certain groups, and that this gives them a sense of meaning and a sense of who they are as individuals. So there is that problem with the group nominalist concept. No one is this disembodied wraith. No man is an island. No man is a totally atomized individual who's fully enabled to create himself, absent any and all outside influences. That's simply not a reality. That's simply not how things are. But one thing that the epiphenomenalist, the group epiphenomenalist concept that I have outlined has to be said in its favor is that, look, the group nominalist, for example, is correct that individuals do have this kind of direct empirical reality to them. You can point to them. They are circumscribed. There are definite, rigid boundaries between one individual and the other, such that you can say, here is person A, there is person B, he is doing so-and-so, she is doing so-and-so, and you can say that directly in a way that it would be sort of more difficult or at least counterintuitive to say to groups. You cannot, for example, point to the white race and say, there it is, right? But it's also the case that not every European, simply by virtue of being a European, is exactly the same as every other European. There are differences between individuals, despite whatever they may happen to share in common. Not every German is hyper-efficient and humorless. Not every Frenchman is a supercilious, wine-sipping douchebag, even though those seem to be rather common qualities among those groups. There are nevertheless individual differences, and there are significant problems associated with merely ignoring those. So the group nominalist does have a point there, and the epiphenomenalist position that I'm describing does take that into account, because it says that groups, insofar as they exist, emerge out of individual action. And this is completely consistent with an acknowledgement of the direct existence of individuals and of their idiosyncrasies and differences that persist despite the fact that they may be members of various groups. So there's that. And of course, the epiphenomenalist position also does not fall into the pitfalls that the extreme kind of realist position falls into, where if you take this group epiphenomenalist view, you remain conscious of the fact that, yes, only individuals directly exist, and although when they associate with one another in various ways and are linked together by virtue of various rules and practices, that the groups that they form are real, but they are not all that there is to any particular individual. There's more to an individual's identity. There are differences. So what I'm saying here is that I'm acknowledging sort of the strengths of each position and attempting to sort of account for the various weaknesses and deficiencies in each view. And as I've said, what would it mean, for example, to be an Englishman had Shakespeare never lived, had Chaucer never lived, had Milton or John Donne never lived, or had there been no Winston Churchill, and so forth. Remove all of these great individuals from English history, and being an Englishman stops meaning what it meant before. And so that leads me to a further point, that there is this interesting relation between the individual and the group, such that if an individual is born into a specific historical or group context, that historical or group context to some degree shapes who that individual is. But it is also possible for an individual, through his action, to have an effect on history and thereby also affect what it means to be part of the group that he was part of. To be an Englishman means to be part of the same group that produced Isaac Newton. And if Isaac Newton had never lived and had never done his work, being an Englishman would no longer mean that. It would mean something very different. So an individual can have an effect on his group's history and therefore change what it means to be a member of that group, while at the same time the group context into which an individual is born shapes that individual. So you have this feedback loop of relations between the two, and it's not simply a linear kind of causal influence as either the alt-right or the liberalists or skeptics might think it to be, where it is group context or historical context, let's say, or that you are a member of a certain race that completely shapes your identity as an individual. That is not the case entirely. But nor is it the case that the individual is the only thing that gives meaning to, or that one's achievements as an individual, I should say, are the only things that perhaps could give meaning to someone as a part of their identity. So again, there's this kind of feedback loop here. And the same is true of the relation, for example, between genetics and culture. So that if you have a certain genetics, or you're part of some genetic cluster group, that cluster group will then tend to have a certain culture, or will be inclined more toward expression in various cultural forms. Germans, again, being hyper efficient, the French being sort of hoity-toity, Americans being workaholics and being kind of, very sort of self-righteous, let's say, if you go back to the kind of WASP stock from which the original American nation emerged. English Reserve, British Reserve, for example, would be a thing like that. Little cultural aspects like this. These, it could be argued, do have a genetic component to them, and so genetics can influence culture in that way. But also, conversely, culture can influence genetics. And anyone who doubts that this is true, there's a very obvious example of it happening right now in the West. Birth rates among the native white population in the West have been dropping, and they have been dropping largely as a result of liberalism pervading the culture of the West. Liberalism, of course, being a part of the West's culture. It's a cultural meme. It's a thing. It's an aspect of the culture and the society that is what the West is. And various aspects of liberalism that may encourage someone not to have children because children may be an impediment to that person's living his life as he wants. It may impose certain unwelcome responsibilities on the individual, or the tendency to view children as just sort of little monsters that will just get in the way of your fulfillment, or that perhaps will contribute to overpopulation and resource depletion, and all these other things, these other thoughts that have been implanted into the minds of Europeans as a result of the prevalence of the liberal ethos within their societies. That has influenced their behavior in terms of having or choosing not to have children, and that in turn will have an effect on the genetic constitution of the European or white race going forward. So you have this circular mutual pattern of influence where genetics influences what culture is, and then culture forms sort of its own structure or its own level that stands above genetics, even if it's epiphenomenal to genetics, and in its own turn may actually wind up influencing genetics. And so again, you have this circular pattern of influence, this feedback loop. And that is one of the things that I would like to point out to members of both of these communities, that they tend to view the causal influence of genetics on culture, or culture on genetics, or of the individual on the group, or the group on the individual, as being sort of unidirectional, that one influences the other, and the only thing they seem to disagree upon is what the order of causal influence is. And what I'm trying to say is that they are both right and both wrong at the same time, that in fact the pattern of causal influence is circular, that one influences the other, and then the other in its turn influences the first in a sort of cycle that way. So that's really all I'd like to say. That yes, it is true that individuals exist in a kind of direct sense that groups do not, and yet it is also the case that the groups that emerge out of individual interactions form the identities of individuals. And also it is the case that certain individuals, by acting in history, can actually influence what it means to be a part of some particular group, and can actually leave their own mark and their own imprint on the practices and the rules that connect various individuals together into some group. So that's all I want to argue for here, this kind of dynamic relationship between the individual and the group. And the final question that I'd like to discuss before ending this is just the question of rights. What then does it mean for an individual to have rights, and what does it mean for a group to have rights? This comes out very starkly in Sargon's conversation with Richard Spencer in one of Andy Worski's live streams, where he just says to him, "Oh, so you believe in group rights?" And again, the thought with him is that if you ascribe rights to groups rather than merely to individuals, you can then have a state which purports to act in the interests of that group, and then seeks to defend the rights of that group, and then may actually wind up trampling on individuals in the process of doing so and becoming extremely totalitarian. So first, let's discuss in general what a right is. Well, I think a definition that would be acceptable to everyone, no matter what your view of rights is that to say that A has a right to X or to do X is simply to say that if B attempts to prevent A from doing X by violence, A may legitimately respond to B with violence of his own. So if you have a right to do so, having a right to do something simply means that you have the right to secure your doing that thing by violence if you should happen to be aggressed upon. It's anything that you can secure for yourself violently. So again, A has a right to do X if A may legitimately respond by force to B if B attempts to prevent A from doing X. So if we think of rights in this way, it's very clear that individuals in some sense have rights. Right? If an individual wants to associate with some particular group or not associate with a group, let's say that some group wants a particular individual to become a member of that group and the individual doesn't want to. So the group attempts to force the individual to do so against his will. The individual may legitimately respond with whatever force he deems necessary to prevent this from happening. And so conversely, let's say some individual wishes to be a member of a particular group, but the group will not have him, and he attempts to impose himself by force upon that group. Well, the group may then forcibly expel him, provided that the individuals comprising that group and the sort of rules that connect the group, the practices that connect the group, are such that the individuals within that group have agreed that, hey, we don't want this person to be a member. So it's clear that individuals have rights, but because groups are epiphenomenal to the individual, this gives group rights a sort of different character from individual rights. Individuals can be sort of easily circumscribed and pointed to, but when you say that a group has a right to so-and-so, whether it is true that that group has that right really depends on the sort of group that you're talking about, and on the nature and the strength of the bonds and the rules and the practices that unite the individual in that group. So let's talk about races here again, because that's what seems to be significant. Is it the case that the white race has a right to its own homeland? Well, if a sufficient number of white people feel a sense of camaraderie and common identity as a white person, and then choose on that basis to act collectively and say, hey, we don't want these people to be living in the land that we live in, and then proceed to take steps to do that, that in some sense is perfectly fine. Now, if you have a state, there are various problems that arise. To what extent can a state be legitimately considered to be acting in the interests of some group? What if there are members of the group that the state claims to be acting in the interests of that actually disagree with the actions of the state, and so on? So there are these complications, but I'm just going to ignore them for a minute. Imagine that you have a stateless society of just white people who have a sense of common identity as white and simply do not wish to allow other people to live in their society. Or it could be just a smaller neighborhood of people, or a corporation or a company which does not want some individual or set of individuals to work for that company. Obviously, they may legitimately exclude someone. And so in that sense, it is coherent to speak of group rights. But again, this would all depend on the structure of the relationships and the rules and the practices that unite the individuals in that group. Let me give you another example. Suppose every white person on Earth simply did not care about their identity as a white person, placed no value on their European heritage, no value on their common genetics, no value on any of this. In what sense could it be said that the white race was acting collectively to achieve anything? I would think that under those circumstances, that wouldn't even any longer be a meaningful concept, because there would just be nothing connecting these individuals other than perhaps a set of shared genetics. But if that genetics isn't valued, then it's of no significance, and in some sense doesn't really even form a meaningful group at all. So, in order for there to be a group, there has to be some set of common practices that are engaged in and agreed upon by the members of that group, thus making the group epiphenomenal to the individuals that compose it. But again, given that this is the case, it means that group rights, insofar as we can speak of them, may exist in some sense, but they would be of a different character from individual rights, and that those group rights would themselves analogously be epiphenomenal to the individual rights out of which they emerge. So just as an individual has a right to free association and to deal or not deal with various people as he may see fit, so a group may do so, but when we speak of a group having the right to do so, it really depends on the nature of the relationships of the individuals comprising that group. So that's really all I'd like to say here. This is my attempt to sort of broker a marriage between these two distinct worldviews. And I think it really allows one to synthesize the positive aspects of each and to ignore or strip away the weaknesses of each approach. So that's all I'd like to say here, and thank you for listening.